Before Frank Abagnale Jr. was old enough to legally drink, rent a car, or even vote, he had already perfected the art of looking like someone you'd trust with your life. Not just trust, but admire. He wasn't born with wealth or influence, but he understood something far more powerful: people believe what they want to believe. At just 16, Frank had already transformed himself from a broke kid with a fractured family into a con man who moved through the world as if the rules simply didn't apply to him. To Frank, life was a stage, and every audience, bank tellers, airline staff, hotel managers, or even federal agents, was eager for a convincing performance. And Frank? He gave them a show they would never forget. Frank wasn't always the sharp-suited phantom who could slip in and out of identities with terrifying ease. He was once just a boy from New Rochelle, New York, trying to hold his family together with the glue of childish optimism. His father, Frank Abagnale Sr., was a charismatic man. He had the kind of confidence that could sell ice to an Eskimo, as they say, a hustler, but one who smiled while doing it. His mother, Paula, was French, elegant, and soft-spoken, a woman who once fell for the big American dream her husband promised. Together, they were the kind of couple you'd expect to see hosting lavish dinner parties, laughing too loud over expensive wine. But when the IRS came calling, the dream began to crumble. Frank Jr. was only 15 when he saw the first crack. His father's dry-cleaning business, once a booming local success, was drowning in unpaid taxes. There were whispers, arguments behind closed doors, and then one day, no more laughter. By 16, the family home was sold, and the Abagnales were living in smaller, humbler quarters. Frank watched as his parents, two people who once seemed unstoppable, grew cold and tired. It shook him. When his parents' marriage finally collapsed, Frank felt like he'd been kicked out of the world he knew. He loved them both deeply, but neither seemed capable of loving him back in the same way anymore. Their focus had turned inward, consumed by their own resentments. So, Frank made a decision: if the world wasn't going to take care of him, he would take care of himself. Not by following the rules, those rules were for suckers, but by bending reality until it fit his needs. Frank's very first con wasn't grand or cinematic. There were no fake airline badges or forged checks. It started with something simple: gas. At 16, he had already developed a taste for driving, fast cars, smooth rides, the kind of freedom that only comes when you're on the open road with the windows down and music blaring. But gas wasn't free, and Frank didn't have a job that could cover his growing appetite for adventure. What he did have was a sharp mind. Frank discovered that gas station attendants were less suspicious of men in uniforms: delivery drivers, truckers, servicemen. So, he bought an old mechanic's jacket for a few bucks, stitched on a fake name patch, and walked into gas stations as if he owned the place. He'd talk fast, crack a few jokes, and hand over corporate account cards he'd scrawled with official-looking logos. 9 times out of 10, they believed him. It was a rush. A thrill unlike anything he'd felt before. He wasn't just saving a few bucks on fuel, he was rewriting the rules of the game. By the time Frank forged his first check, he already understood the psychology of trust better than most adults. Banks, he realized, weren't as secure as they looked. They were big, lumbering institutions, more focused on routine than on catching a clever 16-year-old who smiled just right. He started small. A few checks here and there, just enough to test the waters. He'd walk into a bank wearing his father's old suit, his hair slicked back, his voice steady. He looked like a young executive, maybe a kid from a wealthy family who had just started working for his father's company. Who would question him? The thing about checks in the 1960s was this: banks didn't have the lightning-fast verification systems we have today. If you looked the part and had a convincing signature, you could walk out with cash before anyone knew what hit them. But Frank wasn't content with just a few $100s. He wanted more, much more. And to get it, he needed a bigger persona. One evening, while sitting in a dingy diner, Frank spotted an airline pilot walking in. The man was tall, confident, dressed in a crisp Pan Am uniform that seemed to draw every eye in the room. Something about that uniform radiated authority, respect, and instant credibility. Frank's mind lit up like a pinball machine. What if he could look like that? Pan Am, at the time, was the gold standard of air travel. Pilots weren't just pilots, they were celebrities of the sky. Women swooned, men envied them, and hotels rolled out the red carpet. To a con man in the making, that uniform wasn't just fabric, it was a passport to the world. Frank tracked down a Pan Am pilot and sweet-talked his way into getting an old, discarded uniform. He took it to a tailor, studied the details, and before long, he wasn't just Frank Abagnale Jr., he was Frank Williams, a charming young pilot on layover. The first time he walked into an airport dressed in that uniform, the effect was immediate. Flight attendants smiled. Ticket agents called him Captain. And the best part? No one questioned him when he asked for a seat in the cockpit of a flight he had no business being on. Frank didn't just fly for free, he lived like a rock star. Hotels upgraded his rooms, car rental companies handed him keys without hesitation, and banks cashed his bogus checks as if they were written in gold ink. Every great performance draws critics, and in Frank's case, one particular critic would become his nemesis, FBI agent Carl Hanratty. Hanratty wasn't the type to be fooled by a smile or a fancy uniform. He was methodical, relentless, and had the patience of a hunting dog. When banks began reporting strange check frauds linked to airline pilots, Hanratty started to piece together a pattern. But catching Frank Abagnale Jr. wasn't like catching a common criminal. Frank was always 2 steps ahead, reinventing himself before anyone could pin him down. Today a pilot, tomorrow a doctor, the next day a lawyer. He was a ghost wearing 1,000 faces. For Frank, it wasn't just about money. It was about the thrill. The tension in the air as he handed over a fake check. The split second where everything could collapse, when a suspicious glance or a single wrong word could send him running. But time and again, he found that charm was the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. People wanted to believe him. Legend has a way of hardening around a name, polishing facts into myth until the truth and the story shake hands and agree not to tell on each other. By the time Frank Abagnale Jr. turned 17, his scams weren't merely clever, they were architectural. He no longer dabbled in fraud. He designed it, drafting psychological blueprints that exploited the trust arteries of mid-century America. He had outgrown mere forged signatures. Now he forged systems. And while the public remained blissfully unaware that a teenager was quietly rewiring parts of the nation's financial plumbing, the FBI had begun to sense a phantom current, errant withdrawals of credibility itself. One bank manager called him a well-spoken young executive. Another insisted he was definitely airline crew. A hospital administrator swore he was a conscientious supervising physician. A Louisiana clerk filed him under legal talent. If those descriptors seem mutually exclusive, exactly. That contradiction was the echo agent Carl Hanratty followed like a hound trying to track a scent made of ideas instead of sweat. Frank's genius wasn't only in counterfeiting documents. It was in counterfeiting context. A piece of paper is suspicious alone. Put it in the right pockets, behind the right badge, draped in the right vocabulary, and suspicion dissolves like sugar in hot coffee. Frank began to treat checks the way a stage magician treats silence, as negative space to be shaped, molded, carved into anticipation. Back then, American banks wore sophistication like a new suit, expensive, impressive, but still stiff in the shoulders. Interbank communication lagged. Clearing houses shuffled paper like a monastery of patient monks. A deposited check floated, the float, for days, sometimes a week, before someone definitively discovered there was no cash on the other side. Most fraudsters tried crude forgeries, shaky signatures, obvious erasures, typewriter misalignments. Frank, ever the aesthete, saw the front of a check as almost incidental. The secret language lived at the bottom, MICR numbers, those magnetic digits representing routing and account data. Replace or rearrange those correctly, and you nudged the entire banking apparatus into misdirecting funds like a hypnotized orchestra. He reverse-engineered routing codes by observing patterns on legitimate Pan Am corporate checks he'd managed to glimpse, sometimes in the vest pocket of an inattentive crew member, sometimes left on a hotel counter, sometimes glimpsed inside the translucent envelope of a night deposit bag. He studied not only the digits but the rhythm of spacing, the faint biases in the type style, even the ink saturation variability a real magnetic ink machine produced. It wasn't about copying, it was about speaking dialect. To get the right look, he sweet-talked a printing supply clerk into believing he was an assistant purchasing officer tasked, unfortunately, with the tedious job of sampling check stock quality for a prospective, regional subsidiary. The clerk, flattered and slightly bored, provided blank security paper samples and a vendor catalog. Frank noted watermarks, fiber distribution, and weight. Later, in a cheap rented room, he touched each sheet with reverence, as if they were canvases, because to him they were. He learned that if he pre-printed Pan Am's logo just a touch off register, not perfect, human eyes judged it authentic. Perfection was suspicious. He introduced subtle human error, a minute fiber caught near the logo border, a light speck of ink implying real industrial printing. Meticulous imperfection. That, ironically, was professional polish. Then came the deposit slip gambit. Many banks in those days placed stacks of blank deposit slips in lobbies. Customers grabbed them unguarded. Frank would discreetly steal an entire pad, typeset his own account number, the number of an account he'd opened under an alias with a trivial initial deposit, then return the doctored slips neatly to the counter. Patrons, dozens, sometimes hundreds, would unwittingly funnel their legitimate deposits into Frank's account for days before the aberrant inflow triggered scrutiny. By then, thousands had been vacuumed. He'd withdraw, vanish, and the institution would spend months reconciling phantom arithmetic. While the aviation persona granted global movement, it also became heat-soaked. So Frank experimented with a different form of respectability, medicine. Flight uniforms commanded glamour. White coats commanded trust. He relocated temporarily to Georgia, adopting a new alias, one with middle initials suggesting lineage. He forged transcripts from a West Coast medical school, layering faint letterhead embossing using a homemade die fashioned from softened aluminum and careful engraving. Convincing? Enough. Medical administrators, confronted with a polite young man radiating orderly confidence, rarely suspected a teenage interloper. Frank didn't attempt surgery, he wasn't reckless. He positioned himself administratively, as a supervisory resident doctor whose primary tasks were to observe, sign forms, and shuffle interns into thinking they were being evaluated. Interns, terrified of appearing incompetent, eagerly volunteered conclusions. Frank learned to ask the right summary questions. Vitals stabilized after fluids? You ruled out appendicitis with rebound tenderness? Let's order a comparative panel, protocol first. Short, managerial, crisp. He realized the trick in medicine, for his limited impersonation, wasn't encyclopedic knowledge, it was filtering. Appear to triage information, nod at complexity, then delegate. One evening, an actual emergency arrived, a young boy with a fractured leg. Frank's pulse hammered. His internal monologue, "You are not here to fix bones, you are here to reposition perception." He glanced at the intern already kneeling by the gurney. "Doctor, proceed," Frank said, modulating tone with a practiced blend of authority and collegial trust. The intern, half relieved, half energized, performed routine stabilization while Frank observed, arms folded, facial expression tuned to measured oversight. The boy was fine. Frank exhaled. He later claimed that was when he realized he had trespassed into a moral zone he didn't want to fully inhabit. Banks? Fair game. A child's health? That flickered dangerously close to unforgivable. When he pivoted to law, Frank exploited the perception that credentials equal competence. The Louisiana State Bar exam at the time was grueling, 3 tries allowed. Frank studied law books in quiet corners of libraries, digesting procedural outlines, precedent frameworks, and the skeletal logic of torts, contracts, and criminal law. Was he a polished attorney? No. But he was an adept pattern recognizer, and standardized legal evaluation favors pattern recognition, issue spotting, rule recall, application, conclusion. He reportedly passed on his 3rd attempt. Whether myth has lacquered that detail is a matter of historical debate, but the narrative potency remained irresistible, a teenager bending yet another professional threshold to his will. He secured a position in the Attorney General's office as an assistant, largely performing research tasks. Once more, he positioned himself upstream from detailed scrutiny, where outputs were memos, not surgeries or direct client representation. He observed a motif: the more hierarchical the environment, the easier to hide high within it. Upward supervisors assumed vetting occurred below, subordinates assumed credentials had been verified above. Anonymity through altitude. Perhaps his most audaciously casual persona was that of a sociology professor. He impersonated faculty at a university in Utah, reportedly teaching for an entire semester. Teaching required 2 skill sets Frank luxuriated in: authoritative speaking and improvisational framing. He prepped by inhaling textbooks, not reading them linearly but skimming topographical contours, chapter headings, summary boxes, vocabulary frames, then building lectures as rhetorical arcs. The performance template. Provocative opening question to spark cognitive dissonance. Define core concept with polished concision. Offer analogy bridging abstraction to daily experience. Invite student response, outsourcing complexity. Synthesize as if orchestrating a planned crescendo all along. Did he push academic frontiers? Hardly. Did students feel intellectually engaged? Many did. Education, he discovered, is as much theater as it is transfer. He harnessed curiosity about structure more than command of deep analytic nuance. Agent Hanratty, square jaw, tie knotted like a contract signature, maintained a wall in his field office. Names, bank branches, airline station logs, reported check serial ranges, odd deposit timing clusters. Patterns coalesced. Geographic leaps too swift for ordinary travel budgets of a legitimate young professional. Repeated presence of Pan-Am identity indicators. Check encoding anomalies consistent with one mind refining a technique set. Hanratty hypothesized the perpetrator was not a syndicated crew. Why? Syndicates fragment expertise. Here, the errors, when they occurred, progressed linearly, each iteration less sloppy than the last. That implied iterative learning, a single artisan, not a committee. He pitched for expanded jurisdictional cooperation. Bureaucracy dragged, patience, however, was his marrow. He requested passenger manifest comparisons cross-referenced with suspect deposit timestamps. The process was manual, exhausting, and at times soul-sapping. But slowly, he glimpsed a silhouette, a youthful male orbiting Pan Am's ecosystem without official payroll records to anchor him. Intercut narrative technique suggestion, cut from Hanratty shuffling paperwork under a desk lamp to Frank lounging in a first-class jump seat, sunlight haloing his borrowed uniform. Contrast fuels viewer engagement. Frank mastered temporal asymmetry. He'd seed fraudulent instruments in one city, depart before clearing cycles matured, appear elsewhere under a fresh alias, outpacing administrative realization. His itinerary became a map of preemptive exits. New York, seed corporate-style checks exploiting busy holiday float. Chicago, convert a portion into traveler's checks, harder to trace quickly. Miami, launder appearance into sun-drenched legitimacy, test new ID prototype. Houston, deposit doctored slips, exit with minimal cash to avoid immediate flags. Los Angeles, deadhead, on flights, building logbook lies through conversational mimicry with actual pilots. Atlanta/New Orleans, shift into profession-based personas, doctor/law. Europe, brief stint scout potential retreat zones, stash modest funds. He didn't just run. He curated momentum. Each move created investigative lag. By the time paperwork aligning his presence materialized in one office, he was physically, and narratively, somewhere else. One of the most theatrical escapes occurred when local law enforcement, with FBI coordination, finally cornered him during an identity wobble. Accounts vary in detail, myth and memory holding a polite duel, but the essence is this: Frank leveraged authority recursion. Arrested and temporarily restrained, he projected indignant professionalism rather than panic. Losing composure marks guilt, he reasoned, so compose harder. He adopted a narrowed gaze and a clipped, confidential tone. Listen, he allegedly murmured to a supervising officer, you've got the right instinct but the wrong procedure. I'm with the Bureau. Under deep cover. You just compromised a long-tail operation. I need to speak only with your SAC, special agent in charge. If you process me like a standard caller, you will have explaining to do when the memo surfaces. Confidence plus procedural jargon. He identified the officer's latent fear, career embarrassment. He offered a risk minimization path: treat him less like a prisoner, more like a colleague undergoing unfortunate optics. In the muddle of interagency egos, cracks appeared. A slightly loosened escort. A moment where handcuffs were repositioned. He moved decisively, slipping out, redirecting line of sight, disappearing into architectural complexity, a staircase, a service corridor, a crowd. Was it cinematic embellishment? Possibly in parts. Yet professionals later conceded he had, on multiple occasions, used his "I'm on your side" gambit to erode standard procedure. The morality? Dubious. The psychological precision? Razor sharp. Frank's scams evolved not from greed's linear appetite but from defensive innovation. Each time a bank tightened one procedural screw, he sought new structural gaps. Agent Hanratty's memos grew sharper. He catalogued errors, rare, but present. A slight ink density mismatch on MICR line 6 of a suspect Pan Am payroll-style check. Two signatures with identical stroke hesitation, a mechanical reproduction tell. A timeline overlap. The resident physician apparently logged in at a Georgia hospital the same day similar checks were deposited 900 miles away. Individually, explainable. Collectively, damning. Yet prosecutable certainty required capture. Without Frank's physical presence, the evidence felt like chasing a whisper pinned to paper. Internal bureau meetings bristled with tension. Some older agents dismissed the case as a public relations distraction: no bodies, no syndicate, just money. Hanratty insisted, systemic trust erosion is public harm. Every day he operates, he warned, he refines methodology others can copy less elegantly but more destructively. He was right, vulnerability unaddressed invites replication. It's easy to romanticize the audacity Hollywood already has. But underneath was a growing moral tension Frank himself couldn't fully anesthetize. Pretending to be a doctor flirted with catastrophe. Teaching students under false credentials risked intellectual betrayal. Even the check manipulations, while clever, inflicted administrative pain on bank clerks who had to stay late reconstructing ledger accuracy. Late nights alone he'd occasionally experience, call it ethical tinnitus, a faint ringing awareness that brilliance misapplied corrodes self-respect. He compartmentalized, I'm just borrowing from faceless systems, I'll pay it back later, I'm surviving. Rationalizations are scaffold strong enough to support short bursts of conscience weight, never indefinite loads. Sensing domestic pressure intensify, Frank dipped into Europe. Different clearing protocols. Different languages. Fresh blind spots. France, with its sprawling rail lines and provincial banks, offered both sanctuary and subtle risk. European institutions occasionally over-verified, creating delays in monetization. He couldn't extract liquidity as quickly as in the States. He compensated by reducing check face values, favoring frequency over magnitude, fractalizing fraud. He also discovered an unanticipated vulnerability: loneliness. The adrenaline-saturating American exploits diluted overseas. Conversations lacked the same cultural shorthand, charm required recalibration. Without conversational friction to sharpen his improvisation, his mind looped inward. It's ironic, running created the isolation he claimed to be outracing. Why was he so hard to catch? 3 structural reasons. Use this for an educational retention bump. Fragmented data silos. Pre-digital era meant regional offices guarded information like medieval fiefdoms. Integration lagged. Credential deference. Cultural etiquette discouraged overtly challenging a uniform, a white coat, a legal title. Social friction acted as a force field. Iterative counterforensics. Each near interception fed his improvements. If an airline clerk hesitated an extra beat examining an ID, that ID was retired, the hesitation reverse-engineered into next design parameters. The FBI was chasing an algorithm disguised as a teenager. Ironically, obscurity shielded him early on. But as internal bulletins circulated describing a youthful suspect impersonating professionals, he risked encountering preceded suspicion. His own legend became forensic evidence. The narrative he built to travel frictionless started crystallizing into the net that could catch him. Agent Hanratty began leveraging story against him, encouraged banks to ask subtle age-verifying questions, instruct airline staff to confirm employee ID numbers via internal rosters rather than visual acceptance, prompt hospital administrators to double-check residency placements through centralized directories. Each new friction point shaved margin off Frank's improvisational buffer. Frank distinguished between confidence, the outward aura that invites trust, and composure, the internal equilibrium that prevents self-sabotage under scrutiny. Confidence can be faked, composure requires regulated physiology. He learned micro-breathing techniques, inhale controlled, exhale fractionally longer to trick his body out of sympathetic nervous system overdrive. Primitive biofeedback, years before that concept trended in corporate wellness seminars. Unintentionally, Frank Spree served as a diagnostic audit of mid-century credentialing. Visual ID over-reliance, logos and uniforms outpaced database confirmation. Clerical overload, staff saturated by procedural forms provided fewer cognitive cycles for anomaly detection. Social deference, questioning implied rudeness, politeness subsidized fraud. Agent Hanratty advocated for procedural modernization, centralized verification calls, unique employee identification numbers cross-checked instantly, locked deposit slip systems. Implementation would outlast the chase itself, a subtle institutional legacy forged by a teenage saboteur. No con scales infinitely. Complexity multiplies points of failure. Every new alias added logistical overhead, separate physical artifacts, demeanor adjustments, memory index maintenance. Cognitive juggling invites dropped balls. Frank sensed fraying edges, momentary name confusion when addressed unexpectedly, a lag fraction too long answering a procedural question, a slip of a regional accent. He could keep escalating or pivot toward exit. Yet escalation had become identity. Retiring meant confronting the original wound, a fractured family and a boy who felt left unsheltered. Being somebody else had anesthetized abandonment. Stopping would turn the anesthetic off. Hanratty realized brute force manhunts floundered. Instead, he aimed to compress Frank's option space. Pressure bank networks simultaneously so deposit opportunities shrink. Encourage Pan AM to issue internal memos, making cockpit jump seating more bureaucratic, reduce his free travel vector. Tag allied agencies abroad. Isolate him from the professional ecosystems he parasitized. Predators weaken when habitat narrows. Counterintuitive technique, strategic patience. Instead of publicizing near captures, stay quiet, let Frank grow comfortable, sloppy even. Then, strike while he's mid-transition between identities, when paperwork scaffolding incomplete, confidence high, composure vulnerable. Classic moment of Molt strategy. Frank's most audacious performance didn't happen in a courtroom or a bank, it happened 30,000 feet in the air. His greatest role? A Pan Am pilot. With a second-hand uniform and a smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo, Frank walked through airports like he owned the place. The uniform was his magic cloak. Suddenly, doors opened, people nodded respectfully, and even the TSA of the time, which was basically a guy with a whistle, stepped aside. Armed with counterfeit Pan Am paychecks and just enough aviation jargon to sound like he knew where the cockpit was, he hopped flights to over 26 countries. Luxury hotels rolled out the red carpet. Airlines covered his expenses without realizing they were footing the bill for a con man's world tour. Passengers trusted him with their lives. Flight attendants saw him as one of their own. And Pan Am? Well, let's just say they were not flying high when they found out they were Frank's personal ATM. By 1969, Frank Abagnale Jr. was no longer just a con artist, he was a living legend. Newspapers across the globe whispered about him like he was some kind of criminal Houdini. But legends have a way of catching up to reality. It wasn't the FBI, Interpol, or some high-tech sting operation that brought Frank down. No, it was a single phone call. A woman scorned. An ex-girlfriend who knew just enough to point the hounds in the right direction. France was where the curtain fell. The police stormed in, and for once, Frank had no clever escape plan. No fake ID tucked up his sleeve. No fake accent to sweet-talk his way out. His luck, after years of pushing the limits, had finally run out. Frank's European tour turned dark. He was tossed into a French prison, a nightmare carved out of stone and cold metal. He then shuffled through Sweden's judicial system, each country taking its pound of flesh before they finally shipped him back to the US. By now, the con man who once waltzed through luxury hotel lobbies with champagne in hand was just another inmate in a cheap, gray jumpsuit. But even in custody, Frank wasn't like anyone else. His mind was sharp, his tongue sharper. He had a way of talking that made even the most hard-nosed cops pause. And there was one man who noticed this more than anyone, FBI agent Joseph Shea, the man who had chased Frank across continents. Shea had every reason to hate him, but instead, he saw something rare, a criminal so brilliant he was practically rewriting the rules of fraud. To Shea, Frank wasn't just a con artist, he was a weapon, one that could be used for good. One day, sitting across from Frank in a cold interrogation room, Shea made an offer that would change everything. Work for us, or spend the rest of your life behind bars. And Frank, with that half grin that had fooled banks, airlines, and governments, leaned forward. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just smiled. Frank Abagnale Jr. didn't just accept the FBI's offer, he embraced it like it was his next great role. Only this time, there were no forged checks or fake IDs. His job wasn't to con anymore, it was to outsmart the very kind of criminals he used to be. The FBI quickly discovered they hadn't just caught a crook, they'd caught a mind decades ahead of its time. Frank understood the psychology of fraud in a way no law textbook ever could. He could spot a fake check from across the room, sniff out a scam before the ink even dried. It was like he had X-ray vision for deception. Over the years, Frank transformed from fugitive to trusted ally. He trained agents, advised banks, and built security systems so sophisticated that the very scams he once ran are now almost impossible to pull off. And perhaps the greatest twist of all? Frank Abagnale Jr., the teenage trickster who once fooled the entire world, now spends his life making sure no one else can pull the same stunts. Today, he's a respected security consultant, working with Fortune 500 companies, banks, and government agencies. He's the guy standing between billion-dollar corporations and the next generation of con artists, some of whom probably read about him for inspiration. Frank's life story proves one thing. Sometimes the best way to catch a criminal is to hire one.